začenjamo prvi plenarni blok našega zborovanja. In sicer prvo predavanje bo imel profesor Uwe Krebs o kulturni in naravni zgodovini otroštva v angleščini. Profesor Krebs prihaja z Univerze Erlangen iz Nürnberga, je član interdisciplinarnega inštituta za antropološke zgodovinske raziskave. Od leta 1978 do 1981 je bil zaposlen na Avstrijski akademiji znanosti na Dunaju, nato na Univerzi v Regensburgu do leta 1984. Fokus njegovih raziskav so med drugim izobraževanje, pedagogika, okviri otroštva in mladostništva.
Dobro jutro, gospodi prezident, dragi kolegi. I have to thank the Society of Slovenian Historical Disciplines for the invitation to give a lecture at this very nice place of Slovenia. But to be in time and to limit it and to cover my limited English, I have to read from my manuscript. Some years ago, in Papua New Guinea, at the Aipo tribe, the following scene was observed. A girl of about 3 years old comes along to her mother with a sago cake. Her elder brother, about 6 years, violently took the cake, but the mother now intervened. What did she do? What do you think? She took the sago cake, broke it into 2 parts, and gave it to the young girl. You probably will agree with me that this is an intelligent pedagogic intervention. I mention this to show that educational processes are not developed by the humanities and also do not exist since the epoch of enlightenment. In opposite, they are to be found all over the world and probably as long as human exists on Earth. My intention is to gain your interest for an interdisciplinary perspective on childhood. And the scientific reason for this approach is the fact that children themselves are interdisciplinary phenomena. Different humanities and sciences do research on children, but we have to reflect that the child itself integrates already all the data we found and also those we are still missing. In an interdisciplinary perspective, the phenomenon childhood is at least 6 million years old. If we restrict the concept childhood on humans, what I will do, even though apes like chimpanzees clearly own childhood and use too. You can see some data, comparison chimpanzee-human. So childhood is a term in the natural sciences as well as in the humanities. The concept of childhood could be explicated easily as the time from birth to puberty in the human life. To be in time, additional remarks on concepts, epistemology, methods, and quotations are omitted. They are in the print version which you have at hand. In our time, the topic childhood can profit also from other disciplines. Example given humanities like history and ethnology, as well as sciences like biological anthropology and medicine. My contribution has two remaining parts. First, the book of Aries and the book of Deleuze, and second, data from anthropology concerning childhood. The French historian Philippe Ariès entitled his well-known and impressive book, published 1960, in my translation, The Child and the Family Life at the Time of Absolutism in France. End of quotation. While Ariès, in his original French title, exactly indicated what his book deals with, the title of the English translation, 2 years later, lost this precision and postulates a general validity for some centuries. I quote, "Centuries of childhood, a social history of family life," end of quotation. The German translation, 15 years after the French original, went even further than the English title in being inaccurate. The title, Geschichte der Kindheit, in my translation, History of Childhood, suggests a general validity without restrictions of time and space. With an overwhelming quantity of different facts, conclusions, and coherences in different areas of life, areas proved for a time period in France between the 16th and 18th century, at least this. First, in comparison to today, the childhood in our sense was much shorter, and youth in our sense rarely existed. After a late weaning, children joined the social life of the adults with about 7 years. Second, all this was embedded in a very different meaning of family and society in comparison to today. In strong opposite, some of his interpreters, with no word, Ariès postulated that no real childhood existed there at that time. In 1974, the American psychoanalyst Lloyd Demeuse edited an anthology entitled, I quote, The History of Childhood. From a methodological point of view, this book seems doubtful to me because, in opposite to Ariès, Demeuse postulated a general validity on the base of a few hundred years and one continent, Europe. While Ariès and Demeuse both reflected methodological aspects with their sources, only Ariès restricted clearly the breadth of validity. For the topic childhood, we can generate important data from biological anthropology and from social anthropology. The biological anthropology includes at least two dimensions which are important for understanding childhood. Firstly, the development of the human brain, and secondly, the duration of childhood and youth. Our human brain volume exceeds in adults the brain of his zoologically close relative, like chimpanzees, about 3 times. This has important consequences for the process of giving birth and for human childhood. The newborn baby must be born with a brain which is about double as big as in newborn apes. The ripeness of the brain of human newborns, however, is much lower than in newborn apes. The resulting helpless of the human newborn anticipates already a more sophisticated handling and service from its mother than female apes are mentally able to spend. This behavior, probably supported by a genetically fixed tendency for bonding between mother and her baby, we call motherly love. In the first 2 years, this is mainly, but not only, a two-person relationship with integrated mothers. Compare Bowlby, Ainsworth, Babusek, and others. The other important dimension of biological anthropology for childhood is the extension of childhood and youth. Childhood and youth of humans are about double as long as in chimpanzees or other apes. Humans are biologically adult with the appearance of the last permanent tooth, was about 21 years. With this criterion, the biological childhood, I repeat, the biological childhood ends with the appearance of the first permanent tooth, about 6 years. Then youth starts. With the same criteria, chimpanzees have 3 years childhood and 8 years youth. So chimps are adult with about 11 years. These are very long time spans for the ontogenesis of mammals. And these very long time spans are even double in humans. Both the roots, I must correct me, both reflect the roots of the two premises of pedagogy. The ability to learn, as shown by the brain, and the necessity to learn, as shown by the long time from youth and childhood. No doubt that the function of this prolonged childhood and youth is to adapt by learning to very different circumstances as given by different human cultures, different times, different climates, to find out how variable and how constant the phenomenon childhood was, the social anthropology, the ethnology, can serve. In this area, I published an analysis in 2001 on rearing and education in so-called tribal societies. About 100 classical ethnological ethnographies on tribal cultures were selected for analysis. Criteria were inclusion of all continents except Europe, inclusion of all climatic zones, largely autochthonous conditions at the time of description, and good scientific standards. In case of childhood, the material on tribal cultures showed that it would make sense to differ childhood in these cultures into two parts. First part, time of birth, up to independent walking of the child at about 2 years. Second part, time of independent walking up to puberty. In the first part, I will mention two aspects: mortality of newborn and mother, breastfeeding and mother-child contact. In all analyzed tribal cultures, children are highly desired. From our perspective of today, the mortality of newborn mothers at birth is high, with special treatments, mainly magical practices and spatial separation of mother and newborn from the others for some time. These cultures wanted to reduce the risk of mortality. The meaning is common in all these cultures that the newborn is endangered by some magic influences and protected by others. So a large variety of magic practices and charms resulted. At this point, we may remember that in our own culture, only since the last 200 years, the mortality of newborn and the mother was reduced by medical progress. Next point, breastfeeding and mother-child contact. Nearly without any exception, infants were breastfed for a long time and are kept in close physical contact to their mother day and night. Infants were often carried at mother's body while working inside or outside or while walking. The breastfeeding was done whenever the infants wanted, not to a fixed time. Mostly for a time of 2 years, infants are breastfed. But there are a few cultures, example given, the Inuit of the Arctic Circle and Australian Aborigines, which breastfeed about 4 to 5 years. Although the compared cultures vary maximal, climatically and in type of subsistence, there was very little variation of the intensity of the mother-child contact in this first 2 years. In the light of the already mentioned modern data of bonding research, these are good psychological conditions for early childhood. Also, the longer breastfeeding is positive because, as you know, mother milk is physiologically the best adapted nutrition and delivers some antibodies which protects from some diseases. The German Science Foundation, for example, recommended breastfeeding for 6 months because after 6 months the positive effects of taking over mother's antibodies is finished, while the impairment of modern chemicals in the mother's milk, mainly PCB, goes on. In the second part of childhood, the time of independent working, up to puberty, I will mention 2 aspects. Playgroup and instruction of children. The childhood of this age displayed more pedagogical phenomena. In tribal cultures, the children were early competent in politeness and etiquette in comparison with modern society. The treatment of the children could be summarized as mainly free, not always, but mainly free, affectionate and compliant. It doesn't matter whether an African, American, Asian or Australian or Pacific culture was the case. Playgroup. Differing to our modern societies, in tribal societies, the children play intensively in considerable independent groups of children and later of youth. And these groups are important educational institutions. Because of no school, the children have plenty of time and spend with increasing age more and more time in this group, which is always heterogeneous in age and some years also heterogeneous in sex. The elder children spend the whole day with this group and often already in sex-specific group. Example given, the US ethnologist Ralph Linton reported about the Tanaras from Madagascar that the boys' playgroups were fishing, hunting or playing war. Similar was the report of the Austrian ethnologist Paul Chevesta about the Bambuti pygmies of Central Africa. Chevesta mentioned that boys of 10 years age were already surprisingly independent, as they hunt and gather already successful for their own feeding and organize their day themselves as a group. Colin Turnbull in 1965, an English ethnologist, even stated that the main educational authority for the male children playing at the Bambuti pygmies were not the parents or other adults, but the male youth group. Next point, instruction of children. The play of our children and the professional training of our youth are far from each other. And this is the main difference to tribal cultures. In tribal cultures, the professional activities of the parents are already known to some extent in the late childhood. by observation, by imitation, and by instruction. It is common, example given, that parents of cattle breeding cultures give a small goat or other little cattle to their child, and the child takes the responsibility for it. This may start more as a play, and it will end more as the serious ability of the child. Tribal cultures of farmers often give a little garden with little tools to their children with a similar intention and similar results. This soft transition from play to work could be interesting even for our society, I think. Conclusions. I shortly will draw 3 conclusions. First, if we take childhood as a universal biological phenomenon of humans, which is moderated by a given culture in respect to content and methods, we should look on constants and on variation of the phenomenon. This may enable us to determine the degree of plasticity of childhood, and that will hinder us to overestimate this plasticity. Maybe we tend to overestimate it. At least this time span will be long enough to adapt genetically to these circumstances in the behaviors of the child. A simple example. Today we know our body and mind work together and support each other in the child's development. But in modern civilizations, the daily part of movement of our school children is much too low in comparison to traditional cultures and even in comparison to my own youth. Generally spoken, it seems more appropriate to me to adapt the modern societies in parts to the needs of children and young parents as to adapt the children and young parents to the needs of modern societies. Because human plasticity is a biological phenomenon and not endless. Economic needs are important, but as a cultural product, they could get adapted easier. Second, today the generating of data on childhood could and should profit from an interdisciplinary approach. As a function of the progress of research, the mutual dependencies between physiological, psychological, cultural, and historical aspects of childhood become clearer than ever before. Third, I have to admit that some new problems may occur with concepts and methods with interdisciplinarity. And I'm optimistic that these problems will be solved more and more, because the borders between disciplines, whether we call them humanities or natural sciences, are human constructions to order the world. In a longer historical perspective, we can see these borders of a discipline are always in change. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Krebs. Profesor Krebsu se najbolj zahvaljujem za podano predstavitev, ki je lepo pokazala interdisciplinarnost, izrazito interdisciplinarnost, kadar govorimo o otroštvu.